space heater on the bottom shelf cost $49, and Joanna Reyes had 11. She counted it again anyway, right there in the aisle of Dwyer's Hardware with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the December wind rattling the front doors every time someone came in, stamping snow off their boots. A 5, a 1, 4 ones folded soft as cloth from being carried so long, and a small fist of change she dug out of the cup holder in the car. $11.60. She knew the number. She'd known it before she walked in. But standing there in front of the heaters with their bright orange price tags, she let herself count it one more time, the way you press on a bruise to see if it still hurts. It still hurt. Outside in the parking lot, in the old Corolla with the heater that only worked when it felt like it, her son was waiting. Eli was 6 years old and small for it, and that morning he'd woken up with that whistle in his chest she'd learned to dread, the one that meant his lungs were tightening up like a fist. The apartment had been 51 degrees when she checked the thermostat. The gas company had shut them off 8 days ago. She'd been heating the place with the oven, door cracked open, the two of them sleeping on the fold-out couch in the kitchen under every blanket they owned, and she'd told Eli it was a campout. He'd believed her for about 4 nights. Then this morning he'd looked at her with those serious brown eyes and said, "Mom, my chest sounds like a kettle," and she'd known the campout story was over. So she'd bundled him into his coat and his cousin's hand-me-down boots and driven to Dwyer's because a space heater was $49 and a reconnection fee from the gas company was $217, and she did not have $217 and she did not have $49. She did not have $49. She had $11.60 and a son in the car with a chest that whistled. Joanna was 34. 8 months ago she'd had a life that worked, more or less. Not a good life, not an easy one, but one that held together. She'd waited tables at a supper club out on Route 9 for 6 years, good tips on the weekends, enough to cover the rent on the 2-bedroom and Eli's after-school program and a little left over some months for the jar she kept on top of the fridge, the one she was filling up so that someday they could go to the ocean. Eli had never seen the ocean. She promised him they'd go. Then the supper club closed. Just like that, in April, the owner sold the building to a developer and everybody got 2 weeks' notice and a handshake. Joanna had looked for work all summer. She put in applications everywhere, the grocery, the 2 diners still open, the warehouse out by the interstate that hired and fired in the same breath. But the town was small, the same as it had been getting smaller her whole life, and there were 3 people for every job, and a single mother who could only work the hours her son was in school was not the candidate anybody picked. And there was the other thing, the thing underneath all the rest of it, which was that 2 years before, Eli's father had died. His name was Russell, and he'd been a roofer, and he'd fallen from a job site in a town 2 hours north on a Tuesday in the rain. He and Joanna hadn't been married. They'd talked about it, the way you talk about painting a room you never paint. But he'd been good to Eli, had taken him fishing and taught him to whistle through a blade of grass, and when he died there should have been something. A settlement, workers' comp, something. But Russell had been hired off the books by a contractor who carried no insurance and folded his company the week after the funeral, and the lawyer Joanna couldn't really afford had told her after 14 months of letters and phone calls that there was nothing left to sue, no money to collect, no one to hold. The man simply vanished into a different state with a different company name. So there was no payout. There was no help. There was just a folder full of denied claims that Joanna kept in the bottom drawer because she couldn't stand to look at it and couldn't bring herself to throw it away. People always assumed there was a safety net. She'd stopped trying to explain. They assumed disability or insurance or some envelope of money that came when the worst happened. But the net had holes in it the exact shape of her family, and they'd fallen straight through. So that was how Joanna Reyes came to be standing in the heater aisle of Dwyer's Hardware 4 days before Christmas with $11.60, doing math that did not work no matter how many times she did it. She picked up the smallest heater, the cheapest one, a little ceramic thing in a dented box that somebody had clearly returned. She turned it over in her hands. Maybe, she thought, maybe they'd take what she had and let her pay the rest after the first of the month, when the last of her unemployment came through. People did that. Small-town stores did that. Her own grandmother used to put Christmas on layaway at the 5 and dime, $1 at a time from August on. She carried the box up to the register and that was where she met Trevor Boyd. Trevor was the assistant manager, 26 years old, with a lanyard around his neck and the particular impatience of a man who has been given a small amount of authority and intends to use all of it. He was scrolling on his phone when she set the box on the counter, and he looked up at her the way you look at a fly that's landed on your food. "Find everything okay?" he said, in a voice that meant the opposite. "I did," Joanna said. "I was hoping, I wanted to ask about this one." She put her hand flat on the box. Is there any way I could put part of it down today and pay the rest in 2 weeks? I get paid the first. I can leave you my name and my number, my license, whatever you need. My son's sick, and the heat's out at our place, and I can put $11 down right now. She heard herself say it and hated how it sounded, the begging shape of it. She was not a woman who begged. She had paid her own way since she was 17. But there was a 6-year-old in the car with a kettle in his chest, and pride was the cheapest thing she owned. Trevor set down his phone. He looked at the heater. He looked at her coat, which was good once and was not good now, at the worn boots, at the $11 she'd already started to lay out on the counter, smoothing each bill flat with her thumb. "We don't do that," he said. "I understand it's not normal. I'm not asking for a discount. I pay full price. We don't do payment plans on a $49 item." He said the number like it was a joke, like $49 was a sum no real person could fail to produce. "This isn't a furniture store. You want it, you buy it. You don't, you put it back." A man in line behind her shifted his weight. An older woman pretended to study a display of flashlights. The whole front of the store seemed to go quiet and careful, the way a room goes quiet when something embarrassing is happening to someone else and everyone is grateful it isn't them. "Please," Joanna said, and she heard her own voice crack on the word and despised it. "It's just for a couple weeks. He's 6. He has asthma. The cold makes it worse, and I can't." "Ma'am." Trevor held up a hand. "I've got a line. If you can't afford it, that's not really my problem. There's churches and stuff for this kind of thing. You should call one of them. There are moments that arrange themselves in your memory like photographs, sharp at the edges, lit from a strange angle, and Joanna would carry this one for the rest of her life, the orange price tag, the dented box, the hum of the lights, and the assistant manager telling her that her sick son was not his problem while 4 strangers studied their own shoes. She felt the heat come up her neck and into her face. She felt the particular loneliness of being poor in public, which is a loneliness of being poor in public, which is a loneliness with no bottom to it. She put her $11 back in her pocket. She picked up the box to return it to the shelf, because even then, even humiliated, she was not going to leave a mess for someone else to clean up. "I'll put it back," she said quietly, and turned to go. "You don't gotta put it back, I'll get it." Trevor was already looking at his phone again, already done with her. And that was when a voice came from the next aisle over, low and unhurried, with gravel in it. "She'll keep the heater." A man stepped around the end of the aisle. He was old, somewhere up past 65, Joanna guessed, tall but stooped at the shoulders, in a canvas work coat gone pale at the elbows and a wool cap pushed back off a lined, weathered face. He had a paper sack in one hand with a coil of rope and a box of screws in it. He walked with the slow rolling care of a man whose knees had given him decades of trouble, and he came up to the counter and set his sack down next to the heater like the two of them belonged together. "Ring it up with my stuff," he said to Trevor. "The heater and whatever else she came in for." Joanna turned. "Oh, no, I can't let you do that." The old man didn't look at her right away. He was looking at Trevor, and there was something in his face that made Trevor put his phone down a second time, faster than the first. "What's your name, son?" the old man asked. "Trevor." "Trevor." The man nodded slowly like he was filing it away. "You been working here long?" "Couple years. Mr. Dwyer still owned this place, old Pete Dwyer." He's mostly retired. He comes in Saturdays." The old man took off his cap, turned it once in his hands, put it back on. "Pete and I went to school together. 60 years ago, give or take. His daddy ran this store before him, and his daddy would have crawled across broken glass before he talked to a paying customer the way you just did." He said it without heat, almost gently, which somehow made it land harder than yelling would have. "Now ring up the heater with my things, and you go in the back and you bring this lady one of the good ones, the bigger ceramic ones, not the dented thing somebody returned. And while you're back there, I want you to think about what you're gonna do when you go home tonight, warm, and she goes home to a cold apartment with a sick kid, on account of you couldn't be bothered to be a person about it." The store was so quiet Joanna could hear the wind. Trevor's face had gone a blotchy red. He opened his mouth, closed it, and went into the back without a word. The old man turned to Joanna then, and his face changed completely, the hardness draining out of it, replaced by something so plain and kind that she had to look away. "Don't you let him make you feel small," he said. I've been broke so bad I split 1 can of soup into 3 days. There's no shame in it. The shame belongs to the man behind the counter, and he knows it now, even if he won't say so." I can't pay you back, Joanna said. The tears she'd been fighting since the register were coming now, hot and humiliating, and she swiped at them with the back of her hand. I can't. I have $11. That's everything I have until the 1st. I didn't ask you to pay me back. He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Now, what's your boy's name? Ellie. Ellie. The old man smiled and his whole face folded up into it. Good name, strong name. He stuck out a wide, knuckly hand. I'm Silas Monroe. I do a little handyman work around town, fix folks' porches and water heaters and whatnot, mostly to give myself a reason to get out of the house. Lost my wife 4 years back and the quiet'll drive you out of your mind. Joanna, she said, taking his hand. Joanna Reyes. Yes, thank you. I don't know how to thank you doesn't seem like enough. It's plenty, Silas said. Trevor came back with a heater twice the size of the one she'd picked, still in its sealed box, the good kind with the tip-over switch and the thermostat dial. He set it on the counter without meeting either of their eyes and rang it up along with Silas's rope and screws, and Silas paid for all of it with a worn leather wallet, counting out the bill slow and exact. When it was done, Silas picked up the heater himself, tucked it under one arm despite his bad shoulders, and walked Joanna out into the cold. The Corolla was parked crooked in the snow with the engine running and the exhaust pluming white. Through the back window Joanna could see Eli's small face, his nose red, his breath fogging the glass, and when he saw her he waved with his whole arm the way little kids do, like she'd been gone a year. Silas stopped when he saw him. Something moved across his face that Joanna didn't understand yet. That your boy? That's him. Silas looked at Eli for a long moment through the foggy glass. Then he set the heater box down in the trunk Joanna popped open, arranged it carefully so it wouldn't slide, and shut the lid with both hands. You got someplace warm to be tonight? He asked. Because that heater'll take the chill off one room, but it won't fix a furnace, and a boy with a bad chest shouldn't be breathing cold air for 2 more weeks while you wait on a paycheck. We'll be okay, Joanna said, which was what she always said. Silas studied her. He had a way of looking at a person that didn't feel like being looked at, that felt instead like being seen, which was different and rarer and harder to bear. What's the gas company want? To turn you back on. $217, with the reconnect fee. She laughed, a short broken sound. Might as well be $2,000. Silas nodded, like she'd confirmed something. Then he reached into his coat and took out a small spiral notebook and a stub of pencil, the kind a carpenter keeps, and he wrote on it standing there in the snow, and tore the page out and held it toward her. That's my number, he said. And that's the name of a fella I know at the gas company, fella named Hollis, been there 30 years. You call that number tomorrow morning and you tell Hollis that Silas Monroe sent you, and you tell him I'll vouch for the balance, and they'll have your heat back on by supper time. I do work for half the people in that office. They owe me favors I'm never gonna live long enough to spend. Joanna stared at the paper. Mr. Monroe. Silas. Silas, I can't keep you already. Now listen. He folded her fingers around the paper, his hands rough and warm and enormous around hers. I'm gonna tell you something, and then I'm gonna go home because it's cold and I'm old and my truck's heater is worse than yours, he smiled. 40 years ago I had a little girl, younger than your Eli. And one winter my wife took sick, real sick, the hospital kind, and I was out of work, and we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and I was too proud to ask anybody for anything. And one day a man I barely knew, a man from our church I'd maybe said 10 words to in my life, he found out, and he paid our heating bill for the whole winter, and he never once let me thank him. Wouldn't hear it. He just said, you'll do it for somebody else someday. That's the only payment I want. He let go of her hand. I've been waiting 40 years to make good on that, he said. You'd be doing me a kindness, letting me. Joanna couldn't speak. She nodded, because it was all she could do, and Silas tipped his cap to her and tapped on the back window to make Eli laugh and walked off across the parking lot to a battered old pickup with a ladder rack on top. She watched him go. She held the paper with the phone number on it like it was something that might fly away. She called Hollis the next morning. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, a truck from the gas company pulled up outside her building, and a man in a hard hat went down into the basement, and 20 minutes later the radiators in her apartment began to tick and groan and breathe out heat for the first time in 9 days. Ellie stood in the middle of the living room in his socks with his arms held out toward the warmth like a man at a campfire, and he looked at Joanna and said, "It's warm, Mom," in a voice of such pure astonishment that she had to go into the bathroom and run the water so he wouldn't hear her crying. That should have been the end of it. A good deed, a warm apartment, a story to tell. But Silas Monroe was not finished, and neither, it turned out, was the rest of the town. Because here is the thing about small places, nothing stays quiet. The man who'd been waiting in line at Dwyer's that day was named Gus, and Gus told it that night at the VFW, told it exactly the way it happened. The sick boy in the car, the $11, the assistant manager saying it wasn't his problem, and old Silas Monroe stepping out of the next aisle like the wrath of God in a wool cap. And the people at the VFW told their wives, and their wives told it at the hair salon and the church and the line at the pharmacy, and by Sunday it had gone all the way around Harlan's Crossing and come back changed, the way stories do, bigger and brighter at the edges, but true at the heart of it. Pete Dwyer heard it. Old Pete came into his own store that Saturday, the way he always did, to drink coffee in the back office and feel useful, and somebody at the counter mentioned it to him. Careful, the way you mention a thing you're not sure the boss knows. Pete listened. Pete did not say much, but on Monday morning Trevor Boyd was called into the back office, and what was said in there nobody heard, but Trevor came out white and quiet, and by the end of the week there was a new sign taped up by the register in Pete Dwyer's own shaky handwriting that said WEHUBLP need chains Throving Nates Withers here, ask me. And Trevor was the one who had to ring up the items for the hardship account Pete set up, a little fund where folks could put a few dollars toward a stranger's heater or a kid's winter coat. Pete made Trevor manage it. Made him learn every name. It was not a firing. Pete Dwyer was old school, and he believed people could be made better by being made to do better, day after day, until the doing became the being. Whether it worked on Trevor, no one could say for sure, but the man who had once said your problems aren't my problem now spent his Saturdays handing out other people's kindness with his own two hands, and a thing like that gets into you whether you want it to or not. And Silas came back into Joanna's life 2 days after Christmas, knocking on her door on a gray afternoon with that same paper sack in his hand, except now it had a wrench in it. Heard your kitchen faucet drips, he said, when she opened the door. How could you possibly have heard that? Ellie told the lady at the pharmacy, who told my niece, who told me. He shrugged. Small town. You can't get away with anything. Now you gonna let me in or you gonna let an old man freeze on your stoop? He fixed the faucet. Then he fixed the window in Eli's room that wouldn't close all the way. Then he stayed for the dinner Joanna insisted on making, a pot of chili and cornbread, the most she could put together with what was in the cupboard, and he ate 2 bowls and told Eli stories about being a boy in a town that didn't have a single paved road, and Eli, who was shy with everyone, climbed right up into the old man's orbit and stayed there. It became a habit, those visits. Silas had no one. His wife was gone and the little girl from his story. Joanna learned this slowly, over weeks, because Silas only ever told you a true thing sideways. The little girl had grown up and moved to Arizona and stopped calling, the way grown children sometimes do, for reasons that get lost between the generations. He was alone in a paid-off house with a workshop full of tools and no one to fix anything for. And Joanna and Eli were alone in a cold apartment with no one to lean on. They fit together at the broken edges, the 3 of them, like a thing that had been put back from pieces. But Silas did one more thing, the thing that changed everything, and it was so like him that Joanna didn't even see it coming. One evening in January he set down his fork and said, "You ever do any bookkeeping? Office stuff. Phones, paperwork, that kind of thing." "I ran the front of house at the supper club for 6 years, Joanna said. "I did the schedules, the deposits, the vendor orders, payroll some weeks when the manager was out." "Why?" Silas nodded slowly. "There's a fella I do a lot of work alongside, younger than me, runs a proper outfit, handyman and small contracting, fixes up rentals all over the county. Good man, honest. But his books are a disaster, and his wife who used to handle all that passed last spring, and he's drowning. He told me last week he'd give a year off his life for somebody reliable to answer the phone and chase the invoices and keep him from going under. Most of it you could do from home, from a laptop, the hours you needed." He looked at her steady. "I told him I might know somebody. I didn't say anything more than that. Didn't want to speak for you. But the work's real, and it pays real, and it's the kind of thing a person can build on." Joanna's throat closed up. For 8 months she had been told no in 100 different ways. No by application portals that never answered, no by managers who took one look at her availability and slid her resume to the bottom, no by an assistant manager over a $49 heater. And now an old man at her kitchen table was holding out a yes, and she'd learned by then not to grab at things, because the grabbing was how you got hurt. "Why are you doing all this?" she said. It came out rougher than she meant. "Really? The heater, the heat, the host, now this. I'm a stranger you met 4 weeks ago. Silas was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow was coming down again, soft against the window he'd fixed. My girl was 7 the winter that man paid our heat, he said finally. Same age as your boy is now. I'd sit in her room some nights after she was asleep, when things were at their worst with my wife, and I'd think, if I lose everything, if it all goes to hell, please God let her grow up knowing the world has good in it. Let somebody show her, because if she learns it's all teeth, all every man for himself, then I failed her worse than going broke ever could. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Well, I didn't lose everything. My wife pulled through that winter, lived another 38 years. And my girl grew up, but somewhere in there I lost her anyway, lost her to distance and silence and whatever I did wrong that I never got the chance to fix. His voice didn't break, but it bent. I can't give that man's kindness back to him. He's been dead 20 years, and I can't give it to my own girl. She won't take my calls. So I'm giving it to you and your Eli, because you're who's in front of me, and because that boy's got the same look my girl had, and because if I don't pass it on it dies with me, and I'll be damned if I'll let it. Joanna reached across the table and put her hand over his, and for a while neither of them said anything, and that was its own kind of conversation. She took the job. The man's name was Carl, and Silas had been right about him, honest, decent, buried alive under 3 years of paperwork his late wife used to manage. Joanna started part-time from her kitchen table while Eli was at school, answering the office phone, tracking down unpaid invoices, organizing the chaos of receipts Carl kept in a shoebox in his truck. Within 2 months she'd found him $11,000 in invoices he'd never sent out, money he'd done the work for and simply forgotten to bill. Carl looked at the spreadsheet she handed him like she'd performed a miracle. He gave her a raise on the spot and asked her to come on full-time, real hours, hours that fit around Eli's school, a regular paycheck that landed every other Friday like clockwork. The heat stayed on. Then the jar on top of the fridge, the ocean jar, started to fill again, a few dollars a week at first, then more. Ellie's chest got better that spring the way it always did when the cold let up, and Joanna found a doctor through her new insurance who put him on a proper inhaler so the next winter wouldn't be a war. In the following June, 14 months after the day in the heater aisle, Joanna and Eli and Silas Monroe drove 8 hours to the Carolina coast in Carl's borrowed van. And Eli stood at the edge of the Atlantic for the first time in his life and screamed with joy as the cold water ran up over his feet, and Silas sat in a beach chair in his work pants with his trousers rolled up and his bad knees stretched out in the sun, laughing at the boy. The happiest Joanna had ever seen him. But the part of the story she would tell longest, the part she'd tell Eli when he was grown, came later. Because Joanna did not forget where she'd been. She'd stood in public with $11 and a sick child and had a man tell her she wasn't his problem. And a thing like that either makes you smaller forever or it cracks you open and lets the light go both ways. With Joanna it did the second thing. Once she was steady, once the fear had finally loosened its grip enough that she could breathe, she went to Pete Dwyer at the hardware store and asked about that little hardship fund he'd started, the one Trevor managed by the register. She started putting into it $20 a month, then more. She told Pete she wanted it to go to the heating bills first, the gas shutoffs in winter, because she knew exactly what 51 degrees did to a 6-year-old's chest, and she knew exactly what it did to a mother's heart. And one cold afternoon the next December, almost 2 years to the week after her own day in that store, Joanna happened to be at Dwyer's picking up furnace filters when a young man came up to the register with a toddler on his hip and a space heater in his other hand and a look on his face she recognized from the inside, the wide, careful look of a person counting money he doesn't have. She watched him set the heater down. She watched him start to ask Trevor, who took a breath and glanced toward the hardship sign in Pete Dwyer's shaky writing, and said, gentler than he used to be capable of, let me check something for you. And Joanna stepped up before either of them could finish, and put her own card down on the counter, and said the words that had been said to her in that exact spot on the worst day of her life. He'll keep the heater, she said, ring it up with mine. The young man tried to argue. They always do. She folded a piece of paper into his hand with a phone number on it, the number of a fella she knew at the gas company, and she told him not to let anybody make him feel small, and that the shame in a thing like this never belonged to the person at the counter who was short, but to the world that let it happen. And when he tried to thank her, when he asked how he could ever pay her back, she heard Silas Monroe's voice come out of her own mouth, gravelly and certain and warm. You don't pay me back, Joanna said. You'll do it for somebody else someday. That's the only payment I want. Then she carried his heater out to his car, where a child was waiting, and she set it in the trunk and shut the lid with both hands, and she pointed up the road and told him the heat would be back on by supper time. And she watched him drive away into the falling snow with something lit up behind his eyes that hadn't been there 10 minutes before. The same light, she understood, that a stranger had passed to Silas 40 years ago in a town with no paved roads, and that Silas had carried all but time and finally set down in her hands on the coldest week of her life, in the aisle of a hardware store. Over a $49 heater she couldn't afford. It was still going. That was the thing she would tell Eli. It had been moving from hand to hand for longer than any of them had been alive, this small stubborn warmth, and it would keep moving after they were all gone, as long as somebody, somewhere, was willing to step out of the next aisle over and say the words out loud. She'll keep the heater. Ring it up with mine. I keep coming back to that $11. Not the heater, not the cold apartment, not even the words that man behind the counter said to her. Just those 4 soft bills and the handful of change, smooth flat against a counter by a woman who refused to leave that store without putting the box back on the shelf where it belonged. Because that small thing tells you everything about why her life turned the way it did. Joanna was broke, she was scared, she was humiliated in front of strangers, and even then she would not leave a mess for somebody else to clean up. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. The kind of person you are when no one is watching and nothing is going your way is the person you actually are, and the world, slow as it is, eventually answers it back. I've watched people wait for their lives to change like it's weather, like it'll just roll in if they stand still long enough. It doesn't work that way. Joanna got 8 months of doors closing in her face and she kept knocking. That's the part nobody puts on the thumbnail. The grit it takes to fill out the 100th application after the 99th went nowhere, to keep your kid believing it's a campout when really the heat's been cut for 9 days. Silas paid for a heater, yes. But what he was really paying for was a woman who'd already proven she wouldn't quit. Kindness multiplies fastest when it lands on someone who's still trying. And here's the part that matters most. When Joanna got her footing, when she found $11,000 in invoices Carl had forgotten to send, that wasn't luck. That was a sharp, steady mind that had been there the whole time, waiting for someone to stop looking at her coat and start looking at her work. She'd had that in her at the worst moment of her life, the same as she had it in the best. The world just hadn't bothered to ask. So would you take anything from Joanna and Silas and that boy Eli warming his hands at a radiator like it was a miracle? Let it be this. Be the kind of person who puts the box back even when you're falling apart, because your character is a debt the world repays. Keep your head clear enough to see the opening when it finally comes, because it will come dressed as ordinary work. And do not quit in the long dark stretch where nothing is changing, because that stretch is exactly where the change is being earned. Trevor learned the slow way that cruelty cost you something. Joanna learned that goodness, stubbornness, and a steady mind, held together long enough, will outlast almost anything. The warmth keeps moving from hand to hand. The only question is whether yours are open when it reaches you.